The Nintendo Switch is probably my favorite console ever, but very recently I've been wondering if Sony may have secretly created their own Switch almost 20 years ago in 2005 when they released the PlayStation Portable. I've always been a huge fan of the PSP, but I haven't owned one in many years until recently when I reacquired the system with some great games through a crazy deal. While tinkering with my new unit, I rediscovered a significant feature of the system I had long forgotten about or just failed to appreciate as a kid, and I think maybe others have too. I scrolled over to the settings menu, then down to the connected display settings, which led me to an action called Switch Video Output. How familiar! This is a killer feature that effectively turns the PSP into a Switch or a Steam Deck type of hybrid console with minimal setup and some interesting quirks. So let's dive in and see what we're dealing with here. Please remember to subscribe to support the channel for more retro gaming analysis and of course more recent topics as well, really trying to hit that 1,000 subscriber milestone. Now I think the PSP was way ahead of its time in all kinds of ways, and although it sold fairly well to overall positive reception, I still think it's underappreciated in the larger gaming landscape, but I digress. For now, I really want to highlight the fact that this is a 2005 handheld that just magically supports high-quality video output for gaming and all other media functions on the system, more on that in a moment. Sony originally sold these beefy composite cables for the system that allowed you to plug the unit into a TV directly. Remember, this was sort of right before HDMI and HD TVs were fully mainstream. However, in 2024, you can buy modern third-party adapters that allow you to plug the PSP into a TV via HDMI with varying levels of built-in upscaling and thinner cords, which is crazy cool. The one I purchased was cheap and works pretty well. After you wire up your PSP to the TV, you simply go to that cross-media bar, if you remember that classic UI, then down to Settings, Connected Display Settings. Again, the feature is even called Switch Video Output. And then it just works. The PSP screen goes black and the unit becomes your controller, and it all works really well. There isn't any noticeable lag while you're playing, and the picture quality is actually pretty good when you consider the low resolution 480 by 272 graphics are blown up to full size. I'd say it looks roughly comparable to a PS2, obviously a little more low res but still usable, which brings me back to my original point that the PSP is sort of a Switch version of the PS2. Obviously, the PSP doesn't power regulate when plugged in or not, so you're always dealing with the same level of graphics. It's sort of interesting to see these games running on a full-size screen if you've only played them in handheld mode in the past. Some of them look kind of bad, and some look surprisingly good, and part of it just depends on your upscaling adapter. It's also awesome to hear the high-quality PSP sound over a full speaker system, again, kind of crazy for an early 2005 handheld. In many ways, it feels like an alternate reality PS2, a separate adjacent console dabbling in the hybrid console world ahead of its time. So you can obviously just leave the cable plugged into your TV, and anytime you want to play in quote-unquote docked mode, you just plug the cable into the PSP and tell it to output video. Honestly, in some ways this setup actually has a couple advantages over the Switch. The cable fits snugly and isn't as fiddly as the Switch dock can sometimes be. You also don't have to detach the Joy-Cons and reattach them later or own a second controller as an alternative. The PSP basically just turns into a wired controller. It's also cool that, like the Switch, when you unplug or undock the PSP, it doesn't cause any issues. You can just walk away and keep playing your game where you left off, just like modern hybrid consoles. Unfortunately, you cannot do the reverse. To plug the cable in again, you have to exit the current game to get to the main menu. It would be great if the system could detect when you plug in the video output cable and auto-prompt you to confirm that you want to switch displays so you don't have to fiddle around in the menus. That's sort of the Achilles heel of this whole experience, but again, 2005. It's also interesting that Sony never really pursued this hybrid console concept all in when you consider how cutting-edge their handheld hardware always was, and the fact that they were obviously thinking about this scenario on some level to add this feature in the first place. Also, for long play sessions, you'd obviously have to plug the PSP in to charge it, but this isn't all that different than having to charge a controller. My PSP has a brand new third-party battery, And honestly, in video output mode with the screen off, lasts almost as long as my PS5 controller, which has such terrible battery life that I just leave it plugged in most of the time, but again, I digress. This video out feature is also interesting when you consider the multimedia capabilities of the PSP. The portable console famously uses UMDs, tiny discs that look like GameCube discs' little brothers, but that still enabled a good amount of storage for console-like games. However, you could also buy movies on these discs, essentially also turning your PSP into a DVD player alternative of sorts if you leave it plugged in. You can also play video clips and music off of the memory card in the system. This console was always a multimedia powerhouse for its time. As a side note, the video output feature also opens up other possibilities, such as being able to directly capture video off of the PSP, an awesome feature for content creators, obviously. Now, what's also really interesting here is that there's some things about this setup that I actually hope the Switch 2 adopts 20 years later in 2025, and that other hybrid consoles already have. For example, I would actually prefer a PSP or Steam Deck approach to the Switch 2 where the Joy-Cons aren't detachable, and instead we get higher quality controls built into the unit, which might also open up more space for hardware internals and a larger battery, and then maybe the system comes with a cheap separate controller that you can upgrade to a Pro version or something. I understand there's of course value in detachable Joy-Cons for multiplayer and being able to dock your Switch anywhere without having to carry around a second controller, so there's obviously pros and cons to either setup. So did you ever use the video output feature of the PSP? Were people even thinking about this in 2005? What's your ideal docking and undocking scenario for a hybrid console? Did Sony miss a huge opportunity here? Leave a comment and let's discuss.